Live from Shore Manor Studios, this is Tales from a Small Town Journalist with Matt Shore.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out this episode of Tales from a Small Town Journalist, the podcast dedicated to all the weird and wonderful stories you're only going to hear about from reporters working in small communities just like yours. I'm Matt Shore, and I was a small town reporter for almost 10 years before I finally hung up my notepad and my camera. And in that time, let's just say I had some interesting experiences working with the public, and I got to know a lot of other reporters who also had some interesting experiences working with the public. Before I go any further, I do want to make sure and mention this is a listener-supported podcast, supported by wonderful folks just like you. I normally mention a handful of great ways to support us, but this episode, I am only going to mention one, and that is our Kickstarter campaign. We're in the final week of my Kickstarter for Moby Dick, Back from the Deep, this time to publish the complete series. We finished the final issue, and we're putting the whole thing out there in print, so this is the last time we're going to do this. So urge you guys, they call it FOMA, fear of missing out. Don't jump on this time and you will miss out. This is your last chance to get on board the Kickstarter voyage and support the zombie whale and the crazy author who came up with this crazy idea. So please go check that out. The simplest way to do that is to just go to my website, mattshore.net. I have an enormous splash page of that Kickstarter right there. Just click on that link. It'll take you right to it. You can always look it up on Kickstarter, but I want to keep it simple for you. This episode is a little bit different. I've done a couple of little bit different episodes. Now I'm doing another little bit different one. This episode, I wanted to talk to somebody who had previously been in the military, specifically Tyler Haley, my brother-in-law, full disclosure. Tyler served for a full decade before he finally was discharged. And he served in times overseas and here at home. And I thought about it. This is something I've wanted to do for a little while, ever since we pulled out of Afghanistan, and the whole way that whole situation came down. And so I reached out to him at some point just to ask if it was something he was interested in, if he was available to do, and he said he definitely was. So we worked out a time to do it. Now, what I wanted was, we heard from so many people outside of the military. We've heard from congressmen, we heard from legislatures, we heard from presidential administrations, we heard from pundits and ideologues on TV. We never really heard from the people who were there. Or at least I didn't. There's a lot of media out there. Somebody probably did. I'm not going to say nobody did. I'm probably not the first. But I didn't hear much from them. The overwhelming voices we heard were from people that weren't even there. I wanted to just talk to somebody who was in Afghanistan, and Tyler was multiple times. And I just wanted to know, what was that experience like? What was it like for the people there? Very much like when I talk to fellow reporters, I just want to know what their stories are. What's it like for them living this life? So that's what we talked about. It's like, what was it like while you were over there? And I already thought it was kind of relevant still in light of how things ended, but it became a little bit more relevant when, right about the time we decided to do the interview, uh, Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine. And now, as I record this intro, they have, and there is a war going on, and we're kind of on the edge of our seats, wondering if we're going to stumble into World War III. Um, Time will tell on that one. Hopefully, it doesn't happen before this comes up. But anyway, the stories of soldiers, the people who are actually there carrying out the decisions of the people who aren't at risk, what are their stories? They're the ones that I wanted to hear. And so that's why I reached out to Tyler, and big thanks to him in advance. And I'm sure I'm going to thank him again at the close, but uh, thank you for him for coming on and just sharing his story, because it's a good story. It's a worthwhile story. So without further ado, I'm going to switch gears here. We're going to chat with Tyler. All right. I'm chatting with a friend of mine and, full disclosure, brother-in-law, Tyler Haley, a former soldier in the United States Army. I'm not going to try to say his rank and everything because I know I'll get that wrong. So I'm going to quickly stop rambling and let Tyler reveal all that to me. But first off, Tyler, thank you for doing this with me.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad that you asked me to kind of come on and just be able to tell stories and kind of give a day in the life of kind of what it's like being someone that's worn the uniform overseas.
I appreciate that, and it's something and I'm not just saying this because we're related, but I don't take that lightly because I've heard a few soldiers tell their stories, and I know that it can be sometimes it can get kind of raw. It can be real. It's personal because they deal with things that the rest of us don't really deal with. So, what I was asking was not a small ask. So, just again, I just want to definitely say I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a key transition point for most service members in their career. You always hear a lot of people say thank you for your service, especially during the heights of the war. And there's always this awkward thing because what do you really say to that? And it actually took a someone that had multiple deployments to say like, hey, the answer to that is, hey, thanks for your support. And it really puzzled me for a really long time because I'm like, hey, do they really understand? Like they say thank you. Is it more of just like, hey, a quick gesture or that, but do they understand really what they're saying thank you to? I think it was a really good like dawning point for me in my career and it's something that I try to pass on to even people that now being out of uniform is when I hear young service members that like, hey, or like people are saying like, hey, thanks for your service. Like one, understand what they're meaning. They may not totally understand what you go through, but at the same point, make sure that we're kind of doing the same thing back and saying, hey, the support that the generation that I grew up in got compared to the earlier warriors before me is totally different. So I think that's a huge thing. So it means a lot for me too.
Let's make sure we put some perspective on this. How long did you serve?
Yeah. So it's kind of funny today is that I was just looking at the date. I ended 10 years on the dot. I joined the Army 2 days out of high school. I graduated on a Friday, and Monday morning I was in the United States Army, which was a really big transition change for me. I enlisted early. It was June 1st, actually, when I kind of started in 2010. And then I finished up my career towards the end there at May 25th, 2020. So throwing some leap years and things like that, it ended up being exactly 10 years on the dot. So
What, just out of curiosity, I don't think we've ever talked about this, but what prompted you to want to join the military?
yeah, I think it was this just calling me from an early age to always want to be in some type of team organization and be able to kind of do my part. A movie that I still love today and a lot of people would laugh at, but I think a lot of people respect Starship Troopers, right? Going
I
back to
love
like,
Starship Troopers.
Starship Troopers has so many big points and pillars on, but it's like, really like doing your service and kind of doing that and being able to present something for that. So it was young me. I'd always played like Army out in the woods and stuff like that. But as things were kind of getting real, I was getting real with myself. Hey, I wanted to go to college. I wanted to do those things. So I also wanted to do service. So what's something that I could do that allowed me to do both? And the Army was the best choice. So I initially signed up for 6 years. Kind of coming out, which was a big commitment, especially at the height of the war. So me signing up in 2010 was a really big inflection point for a lot of things that were going on, kind of in the overseas fight for us and a lot of the politics that were there. So I joined up. I actually went to so whenever you join the military, everybody goes to a thing called the military entry processing station. I may have that acronym mixed up. The military is great for like all these. So it's called MEPS. Actually went to Nashville, did all those things. And I actually joined, which was crazy. I actually joined to be an aircraft mechanic and go to college at the same time. I was going to go through ROTC. That was the plan, was going to go to WKU, be an electrical engineer, do Army stuff on the weekend, kind of do one and one and kind of get to graduate both. And then I got there and they're like, hey, sorry, we got some things mixed up. The fact that you have glasses, like you can't take this exact job. So we need to look at what you can do. And that changed everything up on the spot. So I went there thinking I was going to join Army Reserves, and I left there with a 6-year commitment to be in the regular Army. And and be in IT. And honestly, it was such a blessing in disguise when that happened. So yeah, did my initial enlistment was 6 years to kind of be a lot of people. My old military title is insanely too long. It was a multi-channel transmission systems network systems operator maintainer. It's just like crazy long name that just somebody had churched up to make sound really cool and nerdy. But at the end of the day, it was really just like working in the IT field, working with satellites and stuff like that, like being able to provide kind of those IT services kind of downrange and for the warfighter.
Well, we know you served overseas on more than one occasion and in more than one place. But the one I guess for the purposes of what we're talking about here, we had initially talked about telling some of your stories from when you served over in Afghanistan, and that I had thought about that ever since we pulled out of Afghanistan and everything really just fell apart. And it seems like since our conversation, as we're recording this, we're on the brink of another, whatever word they decide to use, skirmish, conflict, war with Russia. So that makes it almost maybe even a little bit more poignant, our conversation. But what I wanted to talk about, and we talked about this before we started recording, we heard from all the politicians, we heard from all the news analysts, we heard from all the pundits, and we heard from all the drunk guys at the bars. But we didn't hear very much of, or at least I didn't. I didn't hear much from the guys who were just there. They were on the ground, experiencing it all firsthand. I never heard a lot of their stories, and I knew you were there, and I wanted to hear that story myself. But I also thought, this is something more people need to hear. And not that this podcast is a huge deal, but maybe we can get that message out to a few more people. Just what life was like for soldiers serving over in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. So I'm gonna start off with the disclaimer here. I think it's a really important disclaimer for me. So my story is my own. It doesn't represent the thousands of beliefs and stories of my brothers and sisters that served. I think that's something that's very unique. I think the withdrawal in Afghanistan upset a lot of veterans because everybody had a different view and a different viewpoint. And I'm glad that you're really asking the kind of the side from people that were there. But I just want to kind of put a disclaimer out saying like, hey, my experiences, my opinions, my beliefs are my own. And they're from my time kind of serving in a certain capacity with certain times and get to see certain things. So they may reflect views of others, but they aren't. Every veteran has their own story, their own beliefs. And I think every veteran's entitled to that. I think that's something that comes with your service and having your deployments, whether it's good or bad. I think that's something that every veteran's entitled to. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there that I think, my message is my own. And hopefully there's other people that can relate to that and can see that. But at no point does it represent all of the people that have served and kind of in that capacity overseas.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So
yeah, definitely.
So I think, one of the kind of things that comes into play. So I spent 10 years spent a few years in the good old prestigious 82nd Airborne, where I started out my career, which was a really great opportunity. You kind of grow up with a certain perspective in the military. So I did all 10 years. I was lucky to do it all at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So I started 4 years out in the 82nd Airborne, which is where I did my first deployment to Afghanistan. And it's honestly, we're looking back almost 10 years on the exact day of me landing boots in snow to Afghanistan. So everybody says kind of boots on ground. So the mission that we had kind of been given at the time, so I was a comms guy, so a very different outlook than your normal kind of like infantry or boots on ground guy. I had many different roles and kind of getting to see that, which I really enjoyed. So at the time, the 82nd Airborne, I was attached to the 1st Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division. And we had really been kind of set in to be that last big push. 2012 was a time period where Afghanistan was it was starting to die down a little bit. We still had the fight in us of kind of where we wanted to be. And what we were trying to push out at the time, the coalition effort inside of Afghanistan had really taken foot. And I think it's a really important thing because, America had led off when 9/11 happened. America responded, and so did all of America's allies. And I think that's something that all of my deployments, I think a lot of people don't understand, is where America took this fight, so did a lot of allies that had no stake in the fight. Like they were there supporting their ally, but their nation hadn't been attacked, but they were shedding blood just the same. So in 2012, the 82nd had been really come in to really secure one part and help our last kind of big advance. So we had been sent to Ghazni province. very select part of Afghanistan. It's got some mountains, but one of the big things that we were really working on was really securing one highway, which was Highway 1, which led from Kandahar Airfield all the way up to kind of the northern part, which was Bagram Airfield in Kabul, the capital at the time. So we were really coming back in and trying to take that back from the Taliban at the time. So we landed boots in snow. Most conventional forces that come into Afghanistan, you kind of get like a week orientation. You land, you kind of get the, hey, these are the do's and don'ts. You kind of get respun up on like, hey, these are what the newest mines are looking like. This is what's happening. You're kind of getting a refresher course before you really get thrown out into the thing. So I landed. I was in a small little outpost that had just been put in place, and the Polish at the time was the force that we were actually taking over for. So we landed, and I remember we landed in these Chinooks out in what we call HLZ, or helicopter landing zone. We landed. It's like 10 degrees outside, and we step in the snow, and you just sink. And the Polish guy comes out and he's like, hey, you might as well just take your boots off and lace them around, because like you're going to be up to mud and snow up to your knees. There's no reason just to like get your boots wet. And I remember that was like the first like point. I'm like, oh crap. Like, all right, cool. This is going to be an interesting few months. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, is like kind of coming into Afghanistan. Like, one, the first people that like outside of me meeting Americans and things we were meeting our partner forces that were there kind of in the fight. So the Polish had kind of really been responsible for that area. So we got all of our bags, we got them loaded, we kind of walked our spots, we kind of were starting to figure out things there. And I was part of the advanced party. Most military movements will have like an advanced party that's got a very specialized like group of people, whether it's like your IT guys or your leaders. They're really there to kind of help orchestrate the larger forces coming in to make sure everything's kind of prepped and ready. So I was part of that advanced force, kind of making sure everything was set up, everything like phones, computers, making sure like that everybody could talk and stuff like that. But I remember kind of coming in, and this is a memory that I'll never forget, is, coming in, I was there for like 4 or 5 days, hadn't heard any gunshots, hadn't heard like any rockets or anything. It was like so crazy. I was like, man, it's so quiet. Like our intel briefing said, like expect like for us to get rocketed a lot and all these things. So we were talking to our Polish counterparts, and they're like, yeah, we don't get rocketed anymore. I'm like, we were like, anymore? They're like, yeah, well, we don't fire back at them. Like we just go on. We're here to kind of like, just drive around, and we don't really pick a fight. We're here. And this was a really mind-blowing concept for a lot of us Americans, right? Like, we're like, what? Like, you're here to fight. Like, what are you talking about? So we kind of get in place, we get our stuff set up. And then finally, about 30 days in, we're really starting to go out on patrol, starting to try to really take over and understand things. And at that time, so one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is anytime you go fight against another nation, they have intel just like we do. So a lot of the things that makes the American warfighter capable is the intel that's given, and we act upon that intel. We try to make good collective decisions. We don't try to get into bad fights whenever we can help it. But the military, or the local kind of Taliban there, could look at an army patch and know, hey, who is coming in? They could say like, hey, so the unit that I was with, the 82nd, it's 2 A's, since we're all Americans. They know the patch, but they also know kind of like what that unit's going to bring. And the one thing that I love about the 82nd is that from a conventional unit, and you'll hear me say conventional and unconventional because I spent time in the conventional forces of the military. That's what you see every day. And I also spent time on the special operations side, the unconventional approach. But the Taliban knew kind of the patch that was coming in. They knew what kind of fight was coming. They knew that, hey, every time that there's been big conflicts in Afghanistan, the 82nd's been at that forefront of helping push that fight. So we noticed very quickly after our first day of being out, of sending troops outside the wire, really starting to do some like figuring out the community and things like that, we started taking rockets. And the Polish, their eyes got big, and they're like, we noticed their timeline had spun up a ton. They're like, hey, we're ready to get out. Like, hey, let's hand this over to the Americans. They apparently are ready to pick a fight. I mean, we had done that. We were just kind of doing our jobs there. And I thought that was a really like quick awakening to understand like America's temperament to how we fight wars. When we come, we try to fight on front where we have intelligence. We make those calculated decisions, but countries know, like when certain people get there at certain times, what's coming and like what's that there. And I think that's that's laid forth by the warriors and the people and the paratroopers that were before me, everything from Afghanistan, and all the other prior conflicts all the way out to WW2 where, the division made its name. And I think that was a very unique kind of time period. And over those like few months that I spent there, and I kind of got a chance to hop around all of Afghanistan in my first deployment, I got to see a different take of Afghanistan. People were just trying to be, living their lives, but at the same time, there's a war being fought around them. One of the things, so it's a fun memory. I was talking to the family about is, I got in country at that time, and I hadn't taken my first shower like most people in Afghanistan at that time. When you're out in the super outpost, like you live off of a wall, like just like a regular like water ball. And that's what you take your showers with if you get lucky. Thankfully in the winter you're not sweating as much, so it's a little bit. But I don't think I took my first shower. It's like I was at least like I'd say probably like 50 or 60 days in until I took my first like real shower. And it was a cold shower too. We got there, like they were like, yeah, they have no hot water. You get a cold shower though. And we're like, you kind of debate whether you want to take a shower or not because it's like 14 degrees outside. So you don't know if it's worth it to take a cold shower. But during that time, I think it was a very different approach because like only the only training that I had like to understand like the local populace and around there was kind of what had been like taught to us as we were getting prepared for Afghanistan. And in 2012, like you were deploying with people that had multiple deployments. The deployment cycle started off early in the war with like people taking 15-month deployments, then 12-month deployments, then 9-month deployments. Like you only get your experiences from those around you that had been deployed before. So I think my earliest like recognition of like getting into Afghanistan was one, understanding like our heavy reliance on coalition forces and kind of understanding the difference in that and what it means sometimes for that American warfighter coming in. Because I remember there was days, hands down, I think the deadliest day that we had out at that outpost, I think we took close to 40 different or 40 rockets and mortars in succession, meaning that like, hey, we were getting hit like mortars and rockets coming in nonstop for a few minutes. And you're really just like thinking about like kind of where you're living. You're not really in these big protected buildings or anything. We're living in draped tents with some sandbags set up around something. So if a mortar comes in over top of your tent, it's just not your day. And I think that was like a time period where, everybody has a different story on that and what that kind of brought for them. So like there was a really different temperament kind of coming into Afghanistan, but we were that, hey, we're still here to fight. We're here for a reason. So the days that we would get rocketed and things like that were also the days that we'd fight back so hard. I can remember that day that we hands down was our worst. I mean, like over that day, we'd probably been hit like 40 times probably. And after we got hit and we did our battle assessment and we treated the wounded and we made sure people were getting evac'd out that had been hit or some of the people that we had lost. The very next thing was we were going in and getting intelligence, like who attacked us. We're going back out. We're trying to ensure kind of like that we're one, making sure this doesn't happen again to us. But we're really trying to root that out. And I think that was like my first like big point of understanding like, hey, this is a whole different place. This is a whole different like community. And I think it was a very distinct thing that was hard for me to like kind of wrap my head around at first. And it's something like talking to people was everybody has this understanding of like war and like people that haven't deployed, they have this understanding of war. Like, you know who you're fighting, they're properly identified. There's no like crazy things, but like a lot of the attacks that we were getting hit with were people that would stand outside of a school with children and they would launch a mortar right beside that school, right at American forces, knowing that American forces would not fire back on school. That like, hey, we are going to make the right decision. We're not going to do that. So for us to be able to make that decision, now we have to send actual Americans in on foot to go find who did this and put us at more risk to do that. And that was like my first realization of like, hey, we're fighting someone that fights by a whole different set of rules. And it's sometimes portrayed on like the major media outlets, but it's not always understood. I think that was like my first big understanding of kind of like what deployments were going to be like. And they kind of really picked up from there. And I think that's one thing that, a lot of veterans like can go a long way. Some people have hate for it. Some people have admiration and understanding in that first go. But I think that was my first ever real big understanding of, hey, the war that we fight in Afghanistan is not your everyday war. It's not like you're fighting someone in a uniform that you understand that follows the same rules that you do, and is kind of there. And I think that was something that was like big for me on my first go.
Out of curiosity, you mentioned the different temperaments. What were some of the temperaments over time? Like, was there this attitude of like, I mean, were there people that thought, once we leave, this is going to fall apart, or were there people that think, we can really make this work? I'm sure there's a lot of variety there, but just
Yeah.
what was your perspective on that?
So I think one of the things on my first deployment, and my first deployment gave me a different taste than my other deployments kind of coming back, because I get to see a true change in Afghanistan at that point. Was it really, it depended who you were talking to. And I say this level of my heart, the 18-year-old from small town Texas that was getting shot at every day had a different look on Afghanistan versus maybe a captain that was making decisions for that in a different part of Afghanistan. So maybe he wasn't getting shot at, could see a little bit bigger picture. And I think that's one of the biggest scopes that, I try to tell people all the time is, I mean, you try to make information, or you try to make decisions on all the information that you have at the time. So like institutional knowledge that you have about a region or things that are there, and then the current information that's coming in. And I think that's like the temperaments really changed on like how close you were to the problem and how much information you had. And I think that's a perfect example of today in the media. You get to see people are quick to form a decision. I would do this with this, but they have a very small piece of the information pool. They don't understand, there's large orders of effect that happen, and the amount of information that you have to be able to see and understand changes your understanding and depiction of that. And I think that was like a big thing. And I didn't understand that, honestly. I had that same kind of outlook of like, hey, I remember my first deployment, we were getting shot at, we were getting blown up. You were getting seeing people with like limbs kind of like, I'll keep it PG. Like you were getting to see the aftermaths of war. And I think, at that first kind of instinct for me was like, man, let's go get them, whatever I can do to enable this fight. Like, let's have this. And it was that first go. And I was always like, why aren't we going harder? Like, why aren't we there? And it took kind of those like upper officials to say like, hey, this isn't my first go to Afghanistan. Like, this is how they fight. We have to make a cool, calm, collected decision. And I think it's an interesting thing too. I think that doesn't get depicted a lot is, I'll give this. I was an enlisted guy. There's two sides in the military side. You have the officer pool and you have the enlisted pool. So I would say like you always hear like the enlisted do the work, the officers just kind of like whatever. That's not an accurate depiction, right? Officers are given, they're put in a very particular position because they have to make decisions, but their decisions have legal ramifications. Right? If they make a decision to attack a village and people get lost, those lives can absolutely fall on that officer, and therefore the decisions they make come back to say like, hey, I made a decision in war, but it can come back to kind of really cause that officer to lose their rank, cause that officer to get tried in UCMJ, or even like to serve prison time over a decision that they had to make in a very hostile environment. And I think that's something that's been very hard. And I think that's one thing that a lot of the military leaders looking back to like from when we started the war to now, I think there has been some built-in padding like, hey, we don't want to make a decision because at the end of the day, it affects not only their lives, but their families' lives too. They have to make a decision pretty quickly for the best thing. And it doesn't matter how much training you provide. I've been lucky to serve at the kind of the highest levels inside of the DoD, as far as kind of around the best people that do what they do. And they have great decision-making cycles. They really work on being able to make good decisions quick. But you're only as good as the information that you're given. And I think that was such a huge part of like my time and getting to see that. And it all come down to like people's temperaments were on the information that they had at the time and kind of like what they had been told. And what they've been told is like everybody, like, hey, the news they read or like the people that they're around. And polarization is a huge thing inside of the military, right? I think it's one of the big topic points for me. I think even looking back at it now, I served under two commanders in chief, President Obama being kind of one of those. He hit on a really good point. is polarization in America has been like more and more building to that. And you see that more in our US forces today, is seeing one side, right? Being less of hearing other people's stories and only being around people that kind of share that same story with you. And that's healthy in a lot of capacities. But it's also very unhealthy when you're trying to understand a different side of the fight. And I think that's where you see people's beliefs in Afghanistan, where you see a lot of the anger is that they've been around people that share that same message to that.
Yeah, polarization, and it all got hung, a lot of it, on the previous administration, and I'm not going to absolve them, but it had been building for decades. I can remember when I was in high school, and we're not going to talk about how far back that is, but I can remember even then, I could see the beginnings of it happening, and so it's only gotten more and more intense over the years. I keep hoping that we're reaching some kind of a tipping point, and we just at least start listening to one another.
Yeah. I think that's one thing. So like my first deployment, I learned a ton, and it was a very unique deployment that I got to learn and see a different side of war. And I got to see a different way that we fought that. And it was, there's this mix. And I think this is one thing that I think most veterans can agree on is there is the war side of things, and then there's the political ambitions part. And I think that's a part that really rubs a lot of veterans, because like, we get to see how we affect the local populace. Like you can ask any veteran, like they all have stories of like, hey, they got to see like an impact that they made on a local community. Like they got to see like, hey, whether, at the time, a lot of the missions that like we were supporting was like, hey, we're going back and taking land over, making sure routes are secure. But we're also building wells and building schools. And we're trying to give, something that's even like more so for me looking back at it now that I have a daughter, like, giving women in that country a chance to become educated and have a voice. And, in part, a lot of the things that Americans take for granted that we have here. And I say take for granted, I don't use that word very lightly. Like I do say that because, it's hard for a lot of people to understand, like they don't see it as taking it for granted. But at the same point, like you've never had to wonder if the water you're drinking is like good, or you've never had to understand like, hey, if you leave to go do something that day, what that's gonna be the last time that you see your family. Or understanding just like the ability to like express yourself in the smallest capabilities, like how like you're taken away from that. So I think you can ask most veterans, like they have stories where they can go back and see like kids kicking soccer balls or being able to see an impact that they made on that community, but at the same point, like be restricted by political kind of things that are out there, some good, some bad. We don't fight wars just, it's just not, American like sons and daughters on the forefront there. I mean, the fights also happen back like in Capitol Hill and things that are there. And I think that's a part that really rubs America in a weird way, especially veterans. And I think especially the pulling out of Afghanistan, that was a hard part because everybody got to see a lot of the things that were there. I think it's fair to say, like, so my first deployment was in 2012. I spent a few more years in the 82nd. Then I transitioned to the special operations side. So I got a good chance. I went to Africa for a little bit. I was working, kind of got to see a few different countries. That was a great deployment for me. I learned a ton there, but then I came back to kind of the fight. And I ended up doing 3 more tours in Afghanistan, then another tour in Iraq and Syria. And every time that I would come back to Afghanistan, I was like, man, I thought my last time was my last time. And I got to really see a difference, right? Like we were no longer like, this was years after kind of we had kind of taken out Osama bin Laden. It had fallen out of political appeal, but we had made a dent. But a lot of the conventional forces were really pulled out of Afghanistan at the time, and the only people that were really there were like people that were holding down like strategical points in Afghanistan. A lot of the special operations units that were there that were very much like conducting very strategical precision like missions that were out there, like really trying to dismantle organizations. And I get to see a lot of people's outlook. Like every time that I came back, everybody had a different outlook. Like everybody was still there for the mission, and everybody was still like making sure things that were there. But we had been in war so long that people were just like, man, this is just like a normal 9 to 5, except like it's not 9 to 5. Like it's like, all right, get on shift at like for me. So most of my later deployments, my daytime working like started like I remember waking up about like 6 o'clock in the evening, like 1800, and like right as people are eating dinner, that's my breakfast. And like we're really like my work schedule is at night, so like that's when we did most of our operations was at night. So like my normal day is at night. So like by the time I'm going to bed, like the sun's starting to rise. Like if more missions had been out, then we would be waiting up longer. So like maybe I'm going to bed at like 10 or 11. Like people are going to lunch, I'm like ragging out for the night, getting ready for the next night. But I started seeing people's like overall like understanding of Afghanistan changing. And, as a lot of the things that kind of wore down in Afghanistan, I think something that was there was, there's a lot of Afghanistan coined a lot of very good general officers and a lot of great leaders. There's a ton of books. Like, if you were to grab, I mean, I have probably like 5 or 6 like books back there that are written by great generals, like on my bookshelf. And some of those like being now how things happened after for them, like General Petraeus, how things happened in the news and what happened in his career. I don't want to discount for the leader that he was, or General Stan McChrystal at the time. These are great thinkers, or other people. One of the leaders that I really get served under, General Miller, Scotty Miller or Austin Miller, he's someone that's going to go down by the names of like Patton and Eisenhower, right? Like an absolutely fantastic leader that understood the fight that he was in. He was actually the commander there in Afghanistan as we were really closing down. So he was the commander at JSOC, which is the Joint Special Operations Command. So very, very strategic, understanding position to really go there and lead the last part of the fight. And we learned a lot from there. And a lot of leaders that were in Afghanistan, like really started to understand the fight that we were in. And I think something that like, as we've looked back now with our withdrawal, something that like, and I've had personal fights, like, I don't say fights is the wrong word to use. I've had like very like strong debates with even like my own family members, like, hey, why do we did this wrong? We did this, we should have done that. And I think a strong part of that came to like, you can't make decisions unless you've been there and you understand the things. Like everything, hindsight's always 2020. And you're trying to make the best decisions, the best information that you have as military leaders. But there also comes that political point there, right? Like that kind of comes and you try to figure a lot of that out. One thing that I think a lot of people really kind of don't understand. So I think something that really hit for me and something that hopefully people can understand just about like listen to this is, one of the big things that came out in the news was like, America left all these like Humvees and all these weapons and all of these things. For one, withdrawing out of a very big country that you've been a part of for 20 years is a very hard thing, right? If we wanted to properly withdraw out of Afghanistan, we're talking about a 5-year commitment. We're talking about like things that are just like really hard to do, where we have so many commitments. And something that I think is a really big thing that I would talk to people about is our perception of time. Time for us, we think about it as minutes, hours, days. When I say, if I say, hey, Matt, I'm moving next week, like I need you to come get your stuff out of my garage, I'm moving next week, you have an understanding of what that means. Like they're like, all right, hey, like throughout the week, I've got to drop the kids off at this time, but like I can only probably get there on Thursday, but I got to get there. Like you understand what I mean when I say, hey, we're leaving in a week. If I tell a large body of a large populace that mostly is uneducated that I'm leaving here in 9 months, they're just trying to make it to next week. So their understanding of time, we keep telling them we're going to leave, we're going to leave, we're going to leave. We need you to get ready. We need you to take these things over. They're never really going to understand time. So we're like, hey, we're leaving in 3 days from now. They're like, oh, well, we're not ready for that. Like, we're not ready for you to leave. We need these things, like all these things are in place. And you've been telling for months and months and months. And there comes a point like where you have to kind of leave. And I think, there was a lot of talks about kind of us leaving things in place. For one, if you looked at how we withdraw or the withdrawal of Iraq, I remember that we were digging huge holes with big excavators and burying stuff right over top of it. The amount of taxpayer dollars to bring one Humvee home is, it's just crazy. We can load like 3 Humvees up in a C-17, like an Air Force, like a big transport aircraft. We can bring 3 of those home and it costs the American taxpayer like $300,000 per trip. At the same point, like those Humvees a lot, and this is where I think I hope, like from my side, and I know we're kind of like time wise here, I'm looking at it and trying to kind of hurry here, is,
Oh, you're fine. Please do not,
you
don't feel rushed.
know, you know, I use the Humvee as a perfect example because I've seen this a lot on my news feed. It was like, we left all of these perfect Humvees for the Taliban to take over. As someone that served 10 years, and you can ask any other veteran, there's no such thing as a perfect Humvee for one. Like, there's no such thing as a perfect military aircraft. Like, every one of them leaks. Like, when I went to jump school, when we first took off, we're like, oh, why would someone jump out of a perfectly good aircraft? And like, as we're taking off, all this like hydraulic fluid is like leaking from the ceiling. They're like, oh, that's normal. Like, well, that's not a perfectly good aircraft. Like, we'll go with like, hey, like, does good. So at the same point, right? Like, we're talking about like, oh, so like there's no such thing as a perfectly good Humvee. But at the same point, like, America, the Humvee has been like America's fighting vehicle for a very long time. Like, we are very much transitioning out of that with the joint lightweight tactical vehicles, the JLTVs, and a lot of the new things that America's moving on. So it's kind of like, we're pushing on from that 88 Honda Civic that everybody's been relying on to get to work for the last 20 years. Like, we know what's broke with it. We know how to fix it. But we also know the weaknesses on it. So like, hey, if we really wanted to destroy that 88 Honda Civic, we know exactly how to do it. It's not a big effort for us. We also know that for that 88 Honda Civic to go, you're going to need these three parts. And in these three parts, trying to find these in the hills of Afghanistan, it's going to be pretty hard. So like, that's a lot of the things that come into play. So it's really understanding the information that you have there. So yeah, it's easy to look and say like, hey, we left 100,000 Humvees and we left 17 helicopters. You're correct. We left these things. We saved American taxpayers a lot of money because, one, it's going to cost us a lot of money to bring those back home. But at the same point, we left no point, like the amount of like infrastructure and weapons and kind of the tools that we left there. Those are all things that we had kind of planned for. And, it wasn't just like, oh, hey, we left like 100 of these things. For one, a lot of the infrastructure that was left over was by our partner forces that that didn't win their fights. And I think that's something that's really like a hard thing for people to understand. It's like, we left a lot of supplies for our partner forces to be able to fight their fight and be able to handle their country. And sadly, they kind of fell apart. And I think there's a lot that goes into that. That's a whole separate podcast in itself. But I think one of the things coming into it is our withdrawal from Afghanistan. People really look at it as it was really violent. We got out, we lost American lives, and we left a lot of stuff. But there was a calculated point in that. And I think that's like when you look at things like, hey, we understand that we left a lot of, like, people really look at the, like, what we left it from a materialistic standpoint. And like, hey, we left these Humvees and these weapons, and like, hey, there's these Blackhawks flying around. The average Blackhawk flying in Afghanistan, like, I was lucky enough to fly with the 160th, kind of right out of where you're from, out there in Fort Campbell, like where they're headquartered out of. And the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, 160 SOAR, they've flown in Afghanistan for 2 decades. I mean, they've been there from the beginning, and they have the best mechanics, they have the best pilots. I mean, they are meticulous about their aircraft, and they are always working on them. Another part broke. Like, hey, we flew 2 missions last night and the aircraft's down for the rest of the day. So like, hey, yeah, we may have left 3 aircraft. That's going to fly for about a day or 2 days max. If you can find someone that can fly one of those bad boys on YouTube, and then, hey, we're not worried about that here in 3 months. You're not going to see Blackhawks flying around Afghanistan in the same capacity. So
I have to admit, I love the idea of somebody watching YouTube and then learning how to fly a military-grade helicopter.
You can absolutely do it. I mean, the joke's there. Like, you can find anything on the internet these days, right?
That's like, fantastic.
I have a really good buddy that's a Blackhawk pilot, and we've joked about this, right? Like what it takes to kind of get there. The supporting system. That's one thing in America. I think that's huge on understanding how we withdrew and what we left. General Patton understood this from very well. I think very highly of him as a military strategist. He didn't really, he was very known for attacking direct, big, large forces, but he was even known more for attacking supply lines, because at the end of the day, supply lines are what wins wars, right? Like, you can't fight a war if you don't have food, ammunition, all the things that are there. At the same point, you can't keep Humvees running if you don't have parts. again, it's that old like thing that keeps running, like all the things that are continuing to break down. So I think that was like such a big perspective, and that was a military perspective. Everybody talked about the materialistic things that we left, but not the part of like, all of the communities that got really heavily dependent on us. And I think those were the big points that a lot of the people thought about, like the military veterans, was like a lot of the people they served with, a lot of the local population that believed in America's mission there to help like kind of bring Afghanistan to a new front. And I think that's a part that every veteran story will be different on, like the relationships, the people they had there, and like getting to see that kind of grow. But also at the same point, like they also got to see like the worst of mankind, and like how mean and how bad like a lot of the forces that we were fighting there. And again, through the years, like I said, I served from 12 to 20, or not 12, 20, 10 to 20, but my deployments were like 12 to like 19. And really getting to see a lot of those like different reactions to like how people are fighting, and how people are doing stuff. And I think that was a very interesting point to that.
One question I would like to ask, if pardon me, if it's not too personal, if you had known everything that you were going to deal with, everything you were going to see, everything you were going to face when you first signed up all those years ago, would you do it all over again?
Yeah, absolutely.
And why?
This is something where it's different for everyone. Me, like more so is, it's trying to like put the foundations in place that we're trying to make a better. America does try to make like an overall better place, like for what we're trying to do. And I think that, the original reason we were in Afghanistan versus the reason we were there 20 years ago, maybe they were aligned in some principles, right? The initial was, hey, we're going to take back and defend America. And 20 years later, we're trying to build the country that, one, doesn't harbor terrorists, but at the same time is self-sufficient. So it's that embodiment of America where we want people to be able to have the same lives that we do. Is that achievable? No. But just being straight honest, like I think that's very hard, especially for a country like with the literacy rate and the things that are there. I think there's a very big correlation on a country's ability to like change versus like how educated they are. And I'm not saying that in a negative connotation. Like I don't mean that. Like I wish like that Afghanistan had the chance to like everyone to understand that it's a very tribal still led thing. And kind of going back there, it's one is getting to see like I want people across the world to be able to have those same things that we have in life. Like you don't have to worry about like your daughter going to school or the education that she's going to have, or to be like taken care of in a or for her to be thought of in a certain way because of a religion states it. You want to make sure that people have running water, and you want to make sure that they like can have a lot of those things. And granted, we have organizations that go do that. There's a lot of NGOs that are still there, that are still fighting for those things. Like looking back on all the conflict, all the things that a lot of veterans go through, is at the end of the day, like one, I do believe that like, the mission in Afghanistan originally set out was to kind of make sure that America wasn't attacked again, and making sure that like we wouldn't see that like fellow Americans wouldn't fall in the towers like they did, or like the flight or the Pentagon that was attacked. We wanted to make sure that Americans were safe, that like you didn't have to worry about that. And I think that mission was achieved. I think the world got to see the resolve of Americans that day, that, we're in this fight, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, the money side, politicians may have one thing, but the resolve of Americans is, we're there to fight. I was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened. So I grew up fighting. I mean, I enlisted and was part of a war that I grew up in. 9/11 I was a kid. And, I was part of that kind of fight coming up. It's like, hey, we were kids then, but we're here now. And we're part of a wave of Americans that, we will stand at her defense at all costs. And, I think that part of the mission was achieved. I think, global terrorist organizations today look at America and understand like, hey, they're getting into a fight, and like they understand like, hey, their beliefs and their causes is justified to them as we are in ours, but that, hey, we aren't going to back down from that. So I am proud that like, hey, our time that we were there, we did the initial calls. think the second part of that is like trying to turn Afghanistan into something that Afghanistan's really hard to turn into. I mean, it has been failed multiple times. And I think that's a part where a lot of people struggle with, and I think a lot of veterans struggle with. A lot of American lives were lost in the hopes of trying to turn Afghanistan into this democracy of like giving the option to be able to decide your future and vote and have these Western ideas come in. I think that's a part that a lot of Americans have a hard time with. And me personally, like, I hate that American lives were lost. And even up to the day that we pulled out, and there's still American lives that are there today. There's still, organizations that are there that are fighting for that. I think that is a question that we'll still kind of look throughout the years. I think that we were able to provide at least a generation some hope, and like that's how I kind of go forward with things, is being able to look that we gave a generation of Afghanistan nationals a chance to understand that life can be different. And I think that's like sowing the seed. So maybe it's not the thing that's here. I think a lot of veterans would say like, for that country to win the war or to be able to go on, like they have to want it. And I think a lot of them did. It is a lot different, but I think we sowed that initial seed to say like, hey, there is an ability to be different and have a different walk in life. And this isn't okay for that. So like going back on like looking at my years of service and all the things that were there and the buddies of mine that's passed away and the countless men and women that have like that spent their last days alive in service of the flag, like that they wore on their shoulder in that country. Hope's probably not the right word there, but like I have to hope that that things that we put in place were there, and then we're the better part of America. America all the time is, you hear people say like, oh, that's not our problem, we need to care about stuff on our home states. But America is looked at as the global figure. When things aren't right, Americans are to be that symbol of like, hey, there is hope, there is things that are here. And I have no problem for my time in service, the time that the countless holidays, that you got to see that I wasn't there. I think there was like 3 years in a row that I missed Christmas. And I don't take those back. From my time in Africa to Syria to Afghanistan, I got to see difference, and that difference may be dissolved in 20 years, and it may have not made a difference. But, it's the small thing for me. It's the hope that like, hey, we did be able to provide like some chance for a generational change. And I think that like for me, that was enough, and knowing that I was there. And I think like most veterans, there's a certain thing like that kind of gets like when and I can say like this, like I won't kind of like go deeper on this, but like I've been around a lot of mission sets, and I've gotten to see a lot of the work that we've done as Americans, whether that's in protection of America or protection of people that are Americans. I think it's a title that a lot of people don't understand, what a powerful statement that means to be American. At any point in the world, an American can leave the confines of the United States, and confines probably isn't the right word, they can leave America's borders. And if they are a United States American citizen, at any point, if something goes bad, there are groups, there are hundreds, thousands of Americans that in any given 1 second will get a pager that, hey, there's an American in a country that tends to do harm to that American. America will not send you a bill for what they're going to do. There's not going to be a single service member that's going to ask for a thank you card. They're going to get on a plane. They're going to fly overnight. They're going to move heaven and earth to make sure like that American is given every chance to fight and live and get back. And I think like that is like such a powerful statement of like understanding what it means to be American, and like being able to give that and hopes to other people. And like the withdrawal of Afghanistan was flawed in a lot of ways, but there's no good way to pull out of anything. It would be coached and it would be looked at in 1,000 different ways. There's always better ways to do stuff. And there was American lives that were lost, hands down. There could have been a lot more American lives that were lost. I think it's a strong statement to say, the attack on Kandahar airfield, or not Kandahar, sorry, going back here, on Kabul International Airport, on KIA there, we lost a lot of Americans that were trying to get out of there. But I think, the experience and information of the war that we've been fighting over 20 years, and the reputation that, hey, if you harm Americans past this point, that, hey, we are going to stay and we're going to fight and we're going to bring it to you. And I think that's one thing that like that still sends and is resounding for me.
Cool. I appreciate it. I know this was real personal stuff. So like I said at the beginning, I appreciate you taking the time and appreciate you sharing all this with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of those that it's, a lot of us talk about a lot of the guys that I serve with, we get together. I mean, this is share an alcoholic beverage. And this is topics we'll talk about one day for hours. So it's hard to really capture kind of, 4 separate deployments plus multiple times in that country for small, like one-offs, to kind of understand kind of what the send off for that country is, and understanding kind of the fight into that. And I think America, you kind of keyed in on Russia right now, which is a very, very different fight. And it's a very different kind of conflict that's there. Something that I personally like, I hope daily that like gets resolved. It's not something that I want to see American lives lost on.
I'll say the one perspective that I have on it, I know everyone has one in this particular case, and I'm not going to pretend that I have the exact right answer, but what I appreciate the fact that the administration is hesitant about getting involved. At least to me, that suggests that they at least recognize the weight and the costs of what this could be and what it could mean. Maybe because Afghanistan wasn't that long ago, and we're like, do we want to do this again? And at the very least, I appreciate that. I'm not going to say I've agreed with every decision they've made, but if there's kind of like, okay, let's make a slow, tempered response. Let's be careful with this. Knowing, because my perspective, I've never served, but I've always kind of viewed it as like, this is, and it's like such a small percentage of Americans that serve at this point. It's that, this is like their gift to the rest of us. Let's not take that lightly. And so when someone in charge is like, okay, let's make sure before we do this, even if they make the wrong call later, the fact that at the front end, they were like, let's be careful. I just appreciate that. And for the most part, most administrations in my lifetime have been that way, that I have seen anyway. Who knows? Behind the scenes, it might be guns blazing, just put on a good show. But
and that goes back to like the amount of information, right? The amount of information that you have versus, right, a decision maker. It all comes back to what the scope that you see with the information that you have versus kind of the scope of a decision maker that's coming there. I think that's a huge point. I think one thing that's every military, like whether you make decisions or not, everyone's taught that, hey, like coming up and making a decision and making a plan is better than no plan. Hey, let's try to do this. Like with the information that we have here, it's better than not making a decision on that one. And it's a very hard concept to make unless you've ever been in that position. I think that's one of those that it's one of those reinforcement learning things. Like, hey, you're like, yeah, that's easy for you to say, but like, trust me, it's someone that's had to be in that position to say like, hey, we need to make a decision, because if we don't make a decision, there's like 100% chance we are not making it out of this. So like we can, and I think that's a big thing.
You made a good point early on that I think gets lost with people here in America because we're not there, that the weight of the decisions being made, like even for somebody who's maybe they're not a general, but they're just a captain, like they got to make decisions that, right or wrong, could result in somebody dying. And that's
absolutely.
And if those people in charge feel that weight, I'm proud that they do. I wouldn't want those decisions to be made flippantly. And so
I think that's a strong thing. It's something that actually I read in 2 books that I think anybody ever gets a chance to read to really try to understand 2 sides of a decision-making thing is the prior Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Mattis, prior CENTCOM commander. I think it's called Callsign Chaos. Great book, gives you the insight of a very, very, very intelligent leader that's both served in all the wars and served under president or under the Trump administration as Secretary of Defense for a good portion. Puts a lot of insight on the decision making that it takes to have and the weight of what it really means to go into war and the decisions that you have to make. So if people have a chance to really like pull that up on Audible and read it, I think it's a very great read. It gives you a good idea into like, hey, someone that doesn't understand things, I learned a ton. It was actually, I mean, it's one of those things that I think that a lot of people out there, but even President Obama, his latest part one of his autobiography, which was a very long read.
Have you read it? I've started. Having a
so
hard time.
Let me quote that. I finished all 38 hours on Audible. It took
me.
Okay.
I'm actually reading it. You got to cheat.
Well, at the same point, it was President Obama reading it, so it's like double the thing because he's a really good speaker, but it's also a little bit longer.
No, that would have helped me if I could have just had his voice. I got to.
he did narrate his own audiobook. It was really good, but it gives you insight into like the decisions and all the factors that play that a lot of Americans don't see. I think that's so critical, and I hope going into that, I hope the days ahead with Russia that I think no leader, regardless if you're a squad leader and responsible for 5 guys, or you're a president responsible for all Americans, sending Americans into a wake where there's a possibility of losing Americans is a very hard decision. It does weigh heavy. Regardless of what political party you align to, there's still a humanity part of any president or any decision maker. And I think it's something that it's a hard decision to make kind of going forward. I'm at the same way where you are. Like, I hope that like, hey, our decisions in the past have taught us something, that our withdrawal is it that we didn't go, our conflict in Afghanistan and all the other wars that we've been in are learning points, and we develop smarter leaders to make better informed decisions kind of going forward and not have to put those service members. So hopefully there's not a generation behind me that's telling the wars of Russia and Ukraine and World War III and all the things that are there. Hopefully, like that we've been there. But I appreciate you letting me kind of tell a little bit of the story there and kind of giving it insights. And again, this is my views and a lot of things that I've had, just kind of getting to see that. And it's different. Every veteran has a different story and a different recollection. And some are good, some are bad. There's a lot of brothers and sisters of mine that I know that are struggling, or like especially with the withdrawal. There's a lot of hate and misunderstanding of the withdrawal there. And my one thing is, anyone that gets a chance to listen to this, is if you know someone that served, give them a chance to just to hear their story, whether you believe in their opinion or not. Getting to hear someone that's lived every day or every minute, like when they're deployed downrange, I can tell you the feeling that you have when you go to sleep, wondering when you wake up to a rocket impacting, or you like walking outside to like go get like your one hot meal a day, and like a round flies right over your head and slams into a wall. Like, you really look at life different. So give that veteran a chance to tell their story. And again, you don't have to agree with it. Just giving them a chance to like hear another side of the story and gather information. You get a new perspective, and it gives you a chance to make a better decision on kind of where you're going in life, and understanding kind of the hard decisions to make when we go into war, because it's not a pretty thing.
I can add nothing to that. That's incredibly poignant, incredibly relevant. That's probably as good a point for us to end on as any.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me, Matt.
All right. Hey, thank you, Tyler. Thanks so much for taking the time. We're all busy these days. And thanks so much for just opening up. And like I said at the beginning, just telling your story, what it was like over there. And like he said, if you know a veteran, just let them tell their story, and he made a great point at the early beginning of this, where he said that, this was merely his, he's not indicative of every single soldier. And just like in everything in life, you're going to have soldiers with different perspectives, different feelings about it, different ideas. You might even have some that completely hate that they did it. And it might be difficult to hear their story, but their story is every bit as relevant as those who were supremely proud of it, and those like Tyler who believed it was important, and that even in light of everything that happened, he wouldn't change a thing. So yeah, So thank you to Tyler. And, if anybody listening to this happens to be a veteran or a veteran, to the veterans listening, hey, thank you so much for all that you've done, all that you still do for us. And if you are related to one, thank you for the sacrifices that you make. Because, for instance, Tyler, my sister is who he's married to, and she had to make sacrifices anytime he was deployed. She stayed home all by herself and in a community that she wasn't very familiar with. And that's indicative of a lot of Army spouses and children and, so on from there. So thank you to everybody in that. And just, if you know any and they have a story to tell, just let them tell it. Don't prompt anything. Just let them tell their story, because their story matters. Their service matters. Everything about it, all of it matters. So as we wrap things up, again, I usually do a bunch of cheap plugs, but this time, once again, I'm just going to plug the Kickstarter again. If you want to show some support, we would love that. Go check out Moby Dick Back from the Deep on Kickstarter right now, the complete series. Simplest way to do it, just go to my website, www.mattshorr.net. That's MATTSCHORR.net. And we'll also have a link in the show notes. But go show some support there. We definitely would appreciate it here in the final week. Help us finish this thing strong. And as we wrap things up, I'll just close out and I'll just say, hey, you know what? Keep reading, keep listening. Thanks.